you very much. And therefore, welcome everybody. It's now, as I think we said, 6 o'clock in Toulouse, or just after, and 11 o'clock in Austin, Texas. And we're welcoming, of course, Dr. Todd Humphreys. And as you should have seen in our email shot, he is eminently qualified to help us on this matter in question. Just very briefly to run through the reason why we're here. The Royal Aeronautical Society was started by the Duke of Argyll in 1866, basically to share knowledge, and that's what we're doing here, to emphasize what was happening in that early period. George Cayley had a sort of wind tunnel, open air, and he was doing experiments then. He produced a glider, which he launched off a hill. And the most important thing is that the Wright brothers actually used part of his findings and letters when they produced their first powered flyer. Now the Royal Aeronautical Society is moved to Hamilton Place in central London, in Mayfair, where of course we have conferences and many types of events there. But beyond the London, we have a number of branches outside, of which of course the Toulouse branch is one, and 87 branches in a number of countries. And also we have as far as Hong Kong and South Africa. This branch was formed in 1991, and Gordon Cole was an engineering test pilot who was the first chairman. So we're working Dr. Todd Humphreys. Very briefly, you can see from his history, I put there that you did your, I think it's correct, your electrical computer engineering at Utah State University. I say this because it may be of interest to young students to see what his engineering background from. Then he did a PhD at Cornell in aerospace engineering, and then of course got heavily involved in navigation, positioning and timing, and of course security from the word go, I think. And you can see that he got in designing software receivers, and again, he I think was one of the earliest people to expose the GNSS vulnerabilities by a demonstration, and going on to confirm that he's had many awards, including for the Royal Aeronautical Society, Royal Institute of Navigation, I should say, which is close to the Royal Aerosoc in London. And so now hand over to you, Todd, and I hope you can share the screen.
Okay, let me attempt to do so. Okay, are you able to see my slides here?
Yes.
Okay, and I'm going to see if I can advance the slides like this, and you're seeing that advancing of the slide, right?
Yes.
Great. Well, look, it is my privilege to join you this afternoon in Toulouse and the morning here in Austin. I am very interested in all things having to do with radio navigation and the security of that. And if you look into the history of radio navigation spoofing, you discover that it was the British who invented spoofing of radio navigation. Maybe we can say that the Germans invented radio navigation and the British invented the spoofing of it. It was back during the World War II when the Luftwaffe was doing raids on London and other areas and needed a way for their bombers to know when they were over the target. So the Germans set up a system of large antennas that would direct beams in multiple directions. Where these beams crossed was the target. And if you were flying an aircraft, you could determine when the beams crossed by listening to a kind of beat phase between the two signals. But what the British figured out is that they could also generate the same types of beams and trigger the early release of the bombs. So, for example, these beams were often named after rivers in Germany, the Rhine, the Oder, the Elbe. And one of the techniques that was introduced early on by British scientist R.V. Jones was the false Elbe, and they generated a signal that looked a lot like the one from that was associated with the Elbe River, which gave the pilots a 5-kilometer heads up before the release. And by initiating the release a little early, they saved many lives in London and other cities with this kind of spoofing. The Germans were so puzzled at how the British were affecting their radio navigation systems that they became convinced that the British had learned how to bend radio waves, and they called them bending the beams. In fact, the British were not bending the beams, they were just falsifying data or falsifying lookalike beams and sending them out to confuse the pilots. Later on, we developed the transit system and LORAN. So LORAN is Cold War technology, so is transit, 1963, 1962. But there does not appear to have been any spoofing, or at least not in the public domain, no evidence of spoofing of LORAN or the transit signals. That's not that they are unspoofable. It's that I don't believe anybody publicly acknowledged having spoofed these signals. Now, I will say about LORAN, and its more modern incarnation as eLORAN, it is very challenging to spoof these signals because even to generate them at such long wavelengths, you need a fairly tall tower. So if you're using a compact device, you won't be able to generate LORAN signals that will propagate very far. It will only be a fairly weak signal that you'll be able to generate. By contrast, GPS spoofing can go many, many thousands of miles. So in 1995, we achieved, GPS achieved the full operational capability. And the basic system is built off of 2 components of the signal, a carrier and a code. The third component, I would say, is the navigation data. And the technique that we know as spoofing is to mimic the entire signal, starting with the carrier and the spreading code or ranging code, and even including the navigation data that overlays the ranging code. The trouble with GPS is that the system from the beginning was viewed as having a military component that would be encrypted and a civilian component that would be open and published such that somebody interested could build a GPS receiver. So if you take the interface specification that was put online around the early 1990s, you will find in that specification all of the information you need to build a receiver. But also, you have all the information you need to build a spoofer. But by the time that full operational capability arrived in 1995, nobody seems to have already built a spoofer, but the system had not any internal protections to prevent such spoofing. The earliest known document about GPS spoofing that I could find is an internal memorandum from the MITRE Corporation that was published in 1995. I say published, but it wasn't publicly released. It was only available and remains available for people inside the MITRE Corporation. You can see citations to it, but you can't read it yourself. I've never read it. I've had people explain its contents to me, but I've never actually read it. I think this is, this is remarkable that the first paper on spoofing was coincident with the full operational capability of GPS. In other words, people recognized this vulnerability from the very early stages. A few years later, in 2001, the Department of Transportation in the United States issued a fairly well-developed report describing the vulnerabilities of GPS to jamming and spoofing. And the idea here was to get out in front of the problem before the Department of Transportation made a wholesale conversion of aviation over to GPS. The DOT wanted to know whether this was a wise thing to do and whether they would be locking in long-term vulnerabilities as they made that transition. In the course of events, well, the transition occurred and many DME stations, VRR stations were abandoned or left without maintenance. And now much of the air traffic control system operates on GPS, but not entirely. The original vision was to be almost entirely based on GPS for both situational awareness and for approach to landing, etc. And I think that this report from 2001 was a good step in the right direction to help us to understand, hey, let's not completely rip out all of the old techniques, because they have proved themselves fairly robust over the years. Back in 2003, Logan Scott, who recently won the Kepler Award from the Institute of Navigation, he wrote a really interesting and prescient paper where not only did he warn of the possibility of civil GPS spoofing, but he proposed some new techniques so that the spreading code or the ranging code underlying the GPS signals could be authenticated by sprinkling in some watermarks in those signals that would not be obvious to anybody except if you knew a special key. And that special key would be released or available on a side channel. Anyway, what's cool about this early paper from 2003 is that the basic idea promoted in this paper was in fact implemented in the NTS-3 satellite's Chimera signal. NTS-3 was just launched back in August, and we finally have a chance to test out spreading code authentication, just like Logan had imagined long ago. Now, I will say that meanwhile, Galileo has dashed ahead and already has implemented what's called navigation message authentication, which was also the subject of this paper. And that navigation message authentication, I think, makes Galileo a really valuable signal today. Chimera is more of a full authentication of not just the navigation data, but the underlying spreading code too. And then in 2008, I produced this paper together with colleagues from Cornell University, and we demonstrated that a software-defined receiver had the ability to be a spoofer if you add a few modules to it. Back in those days, we showed that the simplistic approach of just using an off-the-shelf GNSS signal simulator was sort of limited in what it could do and how clandestine the attack could be. But if you took an intermediate approach like the one we were describing, where you could track the authentic signals and line up your false signals exactly at the location of the antenna, exactly in alignment with the authentic signals, this was a more powerful technique because it had the ability to be fairly covert. We further imagined a sophisticated attack where multiple of these receiver spoofer devices could act in coordination and could emit false signals from multiple directions, thereby even thwarting defenses based on direction of arrival, such as by multiple element antennas. This is a picture of me at the time in 2008. I was at a startup company at the time, just having finished my PhD, and it wasn't allowed to do any of the building of this spoofing device at the startup company, so I had to do it in my home. And that meant we devoted a whole room to the tinkering, and I was neglecting my son and wife during this time, and so my son Ramon came in to remind me of my fatherly duties. Later on, when I moved to the University of Texas, my students helped me to not only further develop the spoofer, but to carry out some fairly high-profile experiments based on our spoofer. In 2012 and 2013, we showed that you could spoof a small drone and make it follow your indicated directions instead of maybe what it wanted to do. We later went into the Mediterranean on a British flagged super yacht, and with the permission of the owner and the master of the White Rose of Drax, we spoofed the ship and caused it to veer off of its so-called rum line, even without making any alarms on the bridge. This was a real shock to me to see how these ships, these massive ships, could be led astray by such a faint signal as what we were broadcasting. And I think it got a lot of attention for this problem. Before 2016, however, there were just experiments in the laboratory or experiments under controlled conditions like the ones that we did in the Mediterranean. There were no publicly known cases of civil GNSS spoofing in the wild. That changed, though, around 2016 when the clouds burst. And we started to see plenty of spoofing activity between about 2016 and 2016 and ongoing past 2018 in the Black Sea. I collaborated with a think tank in Washington, D.C. called C4ADS on the research behind what became a publication called Above Us Only Stars. And these researchers had noticed in the AIS data collected from different receiving stations across the Black Sea region, they'd noticed that many ships at times were reporting their locations at airports. And you can see color-coded here the ship's true locations and the locations reported by those same ships moments later when they were under the effect of spoofing. So this was clearly a case where the GPS receivers on board the ships were being fooled by false GPS signals. And the question was, why make them appear at airports? With further investigation, we concluded that the airport spoofing was to thwart drones that might be used to attack heads of state or important figures, and that the spoofing effects you see here were fairly common when Vladimir Putin visited the Black Sea area to oversee the construction of the Kerch Strait Bridge. And we saw similar spoofing on other trips he was taking at the time. So this was a defensive measure in protection of the head of state. This Above Us Only Stars report is, I think, fascinating reading, and you can go and download this and take a look at all of the data we put together. In February 2017, Cornell University and the Aerospace Corporation Naval Research Labs launched a platform, a palette, they call it, of various experiments that went onto the International Space Station. One of these experiments was a fancy software-defined GNSS receiver, the same one that I had been developing while I was a student at Cornell and then took to University of Texas for further development, and the same one, honestly, that was later modified to become the spoofer that I talked about previously. Anyway, you can hardly see this here, but the three antennas on this flat face are the three antennas feeding that receiver. And this isn't also interesting for its own purposes. All of this was supposed to be for radio occultation studies and air glow measurements and so forth. But during the time that the Black Sea spoofing was occurring, it occurred to me that we might be able to capture some of the spoofing signals from space and geolocate their origin if everything could be done at the right time and place. So I asked the Naval Research Laboratory if they would record the data off of that satellite, off of the International Space Station's software-defined receiver, and then send me the raw recording of the wideband samples. We did this on 3 different days, every time in view of the Black Sea, and report through the data to see what we could discover about the spoofing in the Black Sea. It turned out that in the event, when we attempted to locate the spoofing, the source of the spoofing showed up in Syria rather than on the shores of the Black Sea. And that's not because this emitter in Syria was causing the spoofing in the Black Sea. Rather, it was because at the altitude of the International Space Station, the emitter in Syria was just much more powerful than any of the spoofing that was going on in the Black Sea. And it itself was a kind of proto-spoofing signal. We located it using Doppler-based techniques to a special airbase called the Himemen Air Base, operated by Russia in Syria. So it was the Russians, but it wasn't along the shore of the Black Sea. And the signal wasn't causing the spoofing of ships in the Black Sea. That was some other fainter signal that I wasn't able to detect because of the very strong signal coming from this airbase in Syria. It wasn't a full-fledged interferer, though. It wasn't a full-fledged spoofer. It was generating signals that had the same spreading code as GPS signals, but it didn't have the overlaying navigation data. So clearly the intent was denial and not deception. Later on, though, we revisited the Eastern Mediterranean with, again, the same receiver on the International Space Station. This was in April of 2022. And by this point, the emitter in Syria had gotten more sophisticated. This time around, when we analyzed its L1 and L2 waveforms, we noticed that the waveforms were rather complicated and more wideband than before. This indicated to us that maybe there was plenty more going on in this area than what was the case in 2018. And indeed, when we analyzed the signals as we track through them with our software-defined receiver, we found that there were several authentic signals still available in the data, because the signals as received at the International Space Station, the spoofing signals were not strong enough to completely squelch the authentic signals. So importantly, we were able to get authentic signals with which we could do some Doppler-based measurements of the fault signals. But there were fault signals there. There was a coded jamming signal, much like the one back in 2018. But then there were other signals that had the overlaying GNSS data, overlaying navigation data that makes them full-fledged spoofing signals. However, interestingly, we weren't able to get a navigation fix based on these spoofing signals. They had put the navigation data on there, but they hadn't put it in a way to make the signals self-consistent so that they could reveal a single fix. Anyway, you can see here the evolution, where it started with just coded jamming, then moved on to jamming, coded jamming plus the navigation overlay, and then later on, spoofing that really did have an effect. About that time, around 2020, we started seeing reports pop up around the globe of so-called crop circle spoofing. These patterns showed up off the coast of, in ports around Shanghai and off the coast of San Francisco. I believe now, looking back, that this was a first indicator of spoofing devices making their way into the world without state sponsorship. In other words, now you could buy a spoofer maybe through the black market, maybe through a gray market, and you could initiate this spoofing even if you weren't well aware of the underlying signal processing. You didn't have to be a PhD or some expert to run the spoofers. And I believe that the crop circle pattern is just one of the default modes of these spoofers. So we saw this persistent spoofing around these Chinese ports, as revealed again through the AIS data, but it didn't appear to affect aviation. In fact, I specifically asked one of my students at the time, could you pull in the ADS-B data from the aircraft landing around Shanghai and tell me if you see any evidence of spoofing? And his response was, no, I've looked at the same data or same time period, same location, and I don't see any effect of the spoofing. In other words, it appears that whatever was causing these crop circles around Shanghai was directed horizontally, but was not affecting aviation. Well, then they came for aviation. At the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, just before the conflict began, there were always these hotspots of GNSS interference, but there had been no indications of spoofing of aircraft. It was just interference, jamming mostly. And a lot of this was in the Eastern Mediterranean, as you see here, due to that one airbase in Syria. The same is true, say, a month after the conflict in Ukraine. It's just that now the airspace over Ukraine was impassable to commercial aviation. But as time went on, fast forward to 2024, and you see a lot more interference and further west from its erstwhile locations. And then in September 2023, we got the first clear case of GPS spoofing of a passenger aircraft. The pilot wrote a report explaining that not only did both GPS receivers indicate incorrect locations, but they ended up corrupting the IRS, the inertial reference system. And this wasn't a uniform effect across all aircraft. Some aircraft IRS became corrupted by the spoofing, others did not. But in this particular business aircraft, it was so dire that they had to take turn-by-turn directions from air traffic control because they nearly entered Iranian airspace without authorization due to the spoofing. And this is what we now call broadcast spoofing. After the conflict between Israel and Gaza began on October 7th, 2024, you have hundreds of flights per day in the Eastern Mediterranean that were interrupted by GPS spoofing, where aircraft at 20,000 feet were indicating their location on the tarmac of the Beirut airport, nearly at sea level. And this got the attention of mainstream media. Here, the front page of the Wall Street Journal from 2024 showing that fake GPS signals were filling cockpits and adding risk for air travelers. However, until December 2024, there weren't any cases of aviation accidents due to this interference. It was mostly just a nuisance and a heightened risk, but no accidents were on record. And I like to make the claim that this changed on December 25th, 2024, when the Azerbaijan airline flight 8243 from Baku to Grozny went down. The situation was as follows. The aircraft was flying from Baku to Grozny, and as it entered Russian airspace near Grozny, was subject to intense GPS jamming. This caused the ADS-B transmissions to cease, because ADS-B doesn't like to send out false or misleading information. It would rather just not send out any information at all. And the local radar operators for the surface-to-air missile systems that Russia was using to protect the area from Ukrainian drones, etc., these local radar operators were then no longer able to correlate the ADS-B transmissions from civilian flight, this civilian flight, with the radar returns they were seeing. And without that lack of correlation, one of the radar operators, not the other one, but one, ended up assuming that this was an enemy aircraft. This was exacerbated by the aircraft's not being able to land because it didn't have it couldn't run the GPS approach, and it was a foggy day. And so it did a go around, and it did another go around, and this I think it made it look even more suspicious. I won't say that the ultimate cause of this aircraft being shot down was due to GPS, but I believe that it was a crucial cause in the chain of events. Had it not been for the GPS jamming, the ADS-B would have been transmitting, and it would have been clear that this was a civilian aircraft. So what other shoes will drop? How else is this this kind of interference going to evolve in time? You recall back in the paper that I wrote, I talked about the spoofing risk landscape, and I offered a couple of different defenses against I offered ways of counteracting the primitive defenses that had been published previously. And again, I'd like to draw your attention to this sophisticated attack here, where multiple coordinated spoofers can make it hard for even direction of arrival-based techniques to distinguish the authentic from the false signals. So coordinated attacks could defeat many existing spoofing defenses, including those based on directional arrival, like through controlled phased array antenna. Another evolution in interference concerns its point of origin. And let me describe that by showing you this plot that comes from a continuously operating reference station receiver, a high-end geodetic grade receiver operating in Europe. You see, as time goes along on the x-axis, there is a drop in the carrier-to-noise ratio reported by the receiver across all of these GPS satellites simultaneously. It's about a 5 dB drop across all of the satellites, as you see here. This isn't, in fact, unusual, because these core stations are in public areas. Sometimes they're near roadways where people drive by with jamming devices that might be intended to just protect their own privacy, or to create a kind of bubble of jamming around them. Or if you had a bird alight on the antenna, or if you had a plane fly, very close, a drone fly right over the antenna, then you could see something like this. But in fact, what we saw upon analyzing this event across multiple receivers, we saw that in fact that same event was felt throughout most of Europe, and well up into Svalbard and over in Greenland, and even in northern Canada. So this is indicative of that interference coming not from a personal privacy device, not from even any terrestrial emitter. This must have been coming from space. And there was another event on a second day, and another event on a third day. And by this point, my student, Zach Clements, said, let's look into this more systematically. And he has now discovered some 72 strong events that have the same signature as you're seeing here in terms of the geographical pattern. And also there's a temporal pattern that he has discovered that kind of unifies this phenomenon and has led us to believe that it's probably a single satellite rather than mini satellites, and that the single satellite is very likely to be in geostationary orbit. We published a paper on this at the recent ION GNSS Plus conference in Baltimore, and you're welcome to look up that paper either on our website or in the proceedings of that conference. The basic method that we were looking at to try to pinpoint which satellite might be the culprit was one that started off looking at different cones of possibility based on the elevation angles that each of the continuously operating reference stations could see. And then you take these elevation angles and find their intersection, and you can then eliminate many of the tracked objects. Then you throw out all of the debris that is known to be just inert debris and rocket bodies, and you get a smaller list. So for example, if your elevation mask is 20 degrees, then you have only a few satellites that might meet all of the different events. Now that we've seen 72 of these events, if it's a single satellite, then there are very few satellites that satisfy all of those events. So anyway, like I said, draw your attention to that paper that we published. It's not the final word on it because we wish to do a journal publication where we show which satellite it is based on a more sophisticated technique than this elevation angle based technique. And presently we've been able to boil it down to something like 5 or 6 candidate satellites, most of them in geostationary orbit, but we hope to be able to show exactly which satellite it is with our more sensitive method going forward. What about countermeasures to spoofing and jamming? Well, the first countermeasure that I think we should appeal to is heightened situational awareness. You recall the gpsjam.org website that I showed earlier like this. This has become an invaluable tool for pilots, for ship's captains, to recognize the hotspots where interference is likely to be present. A new tool called GPS Wise was developed a couple of years ago, where the focus here is spoofing. So they show on the same sort of hexagonal grid the spoofed locations and the spoofed to locations, and they show how many aircraft have been ensnared in this spoofing. And if you take a look at this website, you'll notice that hundreds of aircraft per day are subject to spoofing now. And keep in mind that this was not the case. There had been no cases of aviation spoofing prior to 2023. This is a new phenomenon, and unfortunately, my view is this is the new normal. Things are not going to get better from here because nation states view this as part of the defense of their country, and the International Telecommunications Union does allow you to do pretty much anything as far as radio waves go if you believe that it is critical to the defense of your country. Stanford also came up with a nice website that allows you to query each individual report. And between these 3 different websites, you can have fairly good situational awareness. Policymakers and government authorities also need to know where the transmitters are, however. It's not enough to know where the interference hotspots are, but you need to know who's doing it and from where, so that you can maybe apply some political pressure on the countries that are causing a kind of tragedy of the commons for the rest of us. You'll recall that we were able to locate the massive interference around 2018 to this Syrian airbase operated by Russia. And you might be wondering whether it would be possible to locate the source of the original spoofing that caused trouble in September of 2023. And it turns out, yes, the answer was yes. We used assets in low Earth orbit that received those spoofing signals and Doppler-based techniques to locate the source of that particular spoofer with high certainty to the eastern periphery of Tehran in Iran. The broadcast spoofing that was such a problem in 2024 in the eastern Mediterranean, causing all these aircraft to believe that they were at Beirut or Cairo or other airports, turns out to have been transmitted by the Israeli Defense Forces. There's an air base in Israel, that was the locus of our solutions when we used similar Doppler-based techniques from space to locate the source of that spoofing. So this was Israel. And later on, we did back in 2022, we did a dual satellite capture technique that is more powerful than using just the Doppler that we showed in these earlier localization efforts. With dual capture, simultaneous capture, and time synchronized capture, you're able to do powerful time and frequency difference of arrival, and even what are called direct techniques, which is what my student Zach Clements applied here on a box around Syria, southern Turkey, etc., to locate dozens of different interference sources. If you zoom in on each one of these locations that he has shown, you find typically some interesting military-looking equipment at these locations. My recommendation going forward is that the situational awareness of the hotspots of spoofing isn't enough, and we need to set a goal for geolocating emitters. My goal would be that we could locate a 1-watt interference source within 10 meters within 10 minutes. This is actionable, precise information that would allow a response to these sort of emitters in a short amount of time. And it is possible to do from low Earth orbit. The 10 meters in 10 minutes is definitely possible, provided that you have a dense enough constellation. I like to say, in God we trust, but all others we monitor. This is the motto of naval intelligence in the United States. Countermeasure 2 is a legal and policy response, and I hinted at this earlier. Several people went to the ITU conference in 2023 to emphasize the protected status of the GNSS L1 and L5 bands, effectively to complain that the commons was being trodden upon by far too many cattle, and that we were all set to lose this precious clean spectrum if we allowed jamming and spoofing to just run amok. This resulted in Resolution 676 in the World Radio Conference in 23, and it basically reminded the world community, hey, it's not a good practice to be interfering with GNSS. Later on, an even stronger statement emerged. This is March 2025, unprecedented so far as I'm aware, a joint statement from the UN agencies for telecoms, aviation, and maritime shipping, all of them joining together to say, we urgently call on respective member states to protect these radio navigation satellite services from transmissions that can adversely cause harmful interference. And the trouble is that, as I hinted earlier, the International Telecommunications Union has a constitution, and in that constitution is an Article 48. And in that Article 48 is a clause, number 1, that very clearly says that member states retain their entire freedom with regard to military radio installations. In other words, if what you're broadcasting in jamming and spoofing GPS is coming from a military radio installation, you retain your entire freedom to do so. And that doesn't even come with a caveat that says you should not broadcast outside your sovereign territory. This appears to allow exactly what Israel has been doing, exactly what Russia has been doing, and what Ukraine has been doing for the last couple of years. So that's why I say that maybe that's the new normal unless we can change the ITU constitution and strengthen protections. I would limit the carte blanche allowance of interference from military radio installations to a state's sovereign airspace. Sure, you can do what you want, but you better only do it over your sovereign airspace. And I understand that jamming just doesn't work this way, that it wants to bleed outside of sovereign borders because it needs to be powerful enough to have an effect inside. But I do think that if your spoofing or jamming is bleeding outside of your borders, you should be held to account for that. I would recommend revoking ITU voting rights from repeat violating states like the ICAO has done with Belarus for its violations in aviation. Then there is the third countermeasure, and it's called, in my viewing, deterrence through diversity. The idea here is that we need credible backups to GNSS so that we can return to relying on GNSS. Let's get the target off its back. And there are many good backups that we can appeal to, eLORAN being one of them, and various signals of opportunity being others. My own interest is drawn toward low Earth orbit constellations. I see them as offering great promise. And I won't get into this in much detail, but you can have such constellations that are fully dedicated to PNT, or you can build them to be fused, such that there's a PNT mission fused with the primary communications mission. Or you can take opportunistic approaches where you tap into the signals that are already being broadcast for communications and you exploit them for navigation, whether this is in a network aided mode or a standalone opportunistic mode. So there's plenty of research going on in all four of these columns now, and a lot of interesting results so far. Just to show you some of the experiments we're doing here in Texas, we're tapping into the Starlink signals, and we've learned a lot about the signal structure by listening to those signals through this parabolic dish that you see to your left, and then by analyzing the internal structure of the signal. We've published several papers on this, and we can use that knowledge then to locate a simple rover antenna that isn't a parabolic antenna, just a, this could be a very cost-effective $15 antenna. And we can use a kind of differential technique to allow that antenna to be located within a fairly precise air budget. Currently, my students are talking about sub-meter positioning with Starlink. And Starlink has the advantage of being a very strong signal and wideband and having multiple channels. So there's a lot of different resources you can tap into there. In case one channel were compromised, you might be able to go off to another channel. And this has all been discussed in several of these papers that I'm showing you here, where at recent conferences we have introduced these ideas and have shown how far you can go with them. One of the most recent papers that was published around, actually, this date is wrong, it was published in September of 2025, is a signal structure characterization of OneWeb. Like we did for Starlink, we have kind of reversed engineered OneWeb, and we're showing here how you can get effectively a pseudo range out of the OneWeb signal, because we are publishing what you can treat as a spreading code in that signal. That's all the slides I've got. I thank you.